The briefcase was locked. The Russian scientist's hands were shaking. Vienna's January cold bit through his coat, but the sweat running down his spine had nothing to do with temperature. He stood 30 meters from Iran's diplomatic mission, watching the entrance, counting the seconds until his contact window closed. His instructions had been crystal clear. Walk to the entrance, ask for the cultural attaché, hand the package directly to the Iranian intelligence officer who would be waiting. Maintain cover as a disgruntled former colleague selling secrets for cash, then leave. Simple, clean, deniable. But nothing felt simple anymore. The package in his hands contained nuclear weapon blueprints, Russian designs for a TBA-style implosion device, the kind of firing system that could trigger a nuclear warhead. The CIA had spent months preparing this material, inserting subtle flaws into otherwise genuine schematics, hoping to mislead Iranian scientists for years. He'd studied those blueprints, knew exactly where the errors were hidden. One critical timing inversion in the detonator array that would prevent proper compression of the plutonium core. Subtle enough that Iranian engineers might waste years chasing the problem. Obvious enough, if you knew what to look for, that the whole thing screamed deception. His heart hammered against his ribs. Two Iranian security officers stood near the mission entrance, scanning the street with practiced indifference. His contact window was closing. In 3 minutes, the cultural attaché would leave his office. The opportunity would evaporate. The scientist took one step forward. Stopped. His breath came in short gasps. He couldn't do it. Couldn't walk up there and hand over the package, knowing what it really was. Knowing that the CIA had manipulated him into becoming a pawn in their disinformation game. Knowing that even with the flaws, these blueprints contained real information about Russian nuclear weapon design. His eyes darted left. A mailbox stood adjacent to the mission building, one of those diplomatic mail slots used for routine document deliveries. The decision crystallized in his mind. He moved quickly, pulling the package from his coat, shoved it into the mail slot. No face-to-face contact, no risk of recognition, just a physical drop that maintained his cover. But his hand lingered on the package. One more decision remained. From his inside pocket he pulled a handwritten note, 3 sentences in Russian that he had composed in his hotel room that morning against every instruction from his CIA handlers. 3 sentences that would destroy the entire operation. The note read, "I have examined this material carefully. There are errors in the firing sequence design. I recommend independent verification before proceeding with any technical work." He stuffed the note into the package, pushed it through the slot, walked away without looking back. The CIA's most ambitious nuclear disinformation operation had just become one of its worst intelligence failures, and the Russian scientist who'd betrayed the mission was already halfway down the street, heading for the train station, wondering if he'd just committed treason against both sides. Before we find out how the CIA discovered what went wrong in Vienna, I want to let you know what this channel is all about. Every single day, I bring you real spy stories. Not Hollywood fiction, but actual intelligence operations, genuine tradecraft, and the real human consequences behind the headlines. If you're fascinated by the world of espionage, covert action, and the intelligence battles that shape our world, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because Operation Merlin is just one example of how even the most carefully planned operations can unravel in seconds. And the stories coming in future episodes will show you operations that succeeded, operations that failed, and the razor-thin margins that separate triumph from catastrophe. Oh, and real quick, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below with your city and country. It's always amazing to see how far these spy stories reach across the globe. Are you listening from New York, Tokyo, Berlin, Sao Paulo? Let me know. Now, back to 1996, because to understand how Operation Merlin went so catastrophically wrong, you need to understand how seductive the plan looked when CIA analysts first conceived it. The Soviet Union had collapsed 5 years earlier, and the intelligence opportunities were staggering. Russian nuclear scientists, weapons designers, and engineers who'd spent decades working in the most classified laboratories of the Soviet weapons program, were suddenly unemployed, underpaid, and willing to talk. The CIA moved aggressively, recruiting sources, acquiring documents, building networks inside the remnants of the Russian nuclear establishment. One of those acquisitions was a set of genuine Russian nuclear weapon design documents, not theoretical papers or academic research, but actual classified blueprints for warhead components, the kind of material that had been locked in Soviet vaults for 40 years. The documents showed precise specifications for a firing set, the complex system of conventional explosives and timing circuits that compress plutonium to critical mass and trigger a nuclear explosion. This material landed on the desk of analysts in the CIA's Office of Science and Weapons Intelligence. Their job was assessing foreign weapons programs and identifying vulnerabilities. And as they studied these Russian blueprints, a fascinating possibility emerged. What if the CIA didn't just keep this intelligence for analysis? What if they weaponized it? The logic was elegant. Iran's nuclear program was accelerating. Intelligence indicated they were hungry for shortcuts, seeking external expertise, using diplomatic channels and front companies to acquire sensitive technology. Iranian scientists knew the basic physics of nuclear weapons. That information had been in the open literature for decades. But building an actual working device required solving thousands of engineering problems. Getting access to a genuine weapons design would save them years of trial and error. So the CIA plan was this: give Iran exactly what they wanted, but give them a version that was subtly, catastrophically wrong. The analysts identified specific flaws in the Russian design that could be exploited. The most promising was in the firing circuit, the system that synchronized the detonation of conventional explosives around the plutonium core. Nuclear weapons require microsecond precision. If the compression wave isn't perfectly symmetrical, the plutonium won't reach critical mass, and the weapon fizzles. The timing is everything. The CIA's technical team proposed inverting one critical timing sequence in the detonator array. The change was small enough that it wouldn't be immediately obvious, but significant enough that any weapon built using these blueprints would fail. Iranian scientists would spend months or years troubleshooting the problem, running simulations, testing components, never quite figuring out why their firing system wouldn't work properly. Even better, the operation would force Iran to expose their procurement networks. When Iranian scientists tried to acquire the specialized components shown in the blueprints, those purchase requests would light up intelligence monitoring systems. The CIA would map Iran's supply chains, identify front companies, track financial flows, and build targeting packages for future disruption operations. The beauty of the plan was its deniability. The CIA wouldn't deliver the blueprints directly. They'd use a cutout, a former Russian nuclear engineer who could pose as a disgruntled scientist selling state secrets for cash. If the operation was ever exposed, it would look like an independent arms dealer peddling stolen Russian documents, not a CIA disinformation campaign. By early 1997, the plan had a name, Operation Merlin, and CIA leadership was sold on its potential. But from the very beginning, warning signs appeared. The first problem was finding the right asset. The courier needed authentic credentials, real expertise in Soviet nuclear weapons design, so he could answer technical questions and maintain his cover under scrutiny. But he also needed to be controllable, someone the CIA could trust to follow the script precisely without deviation. Those two requirements contradicted each other. A genuine Russian weapons scientist with the right background was likely to be proud, difficult, psychologically complex. The kind of person who'd spent their career in the Soviet nuclear program wasn't usually the kind of person who made an obedient intelligence asset. The CIA found their candidate in 1998. His identity remains partially classified, so we'll call him what CIA handlers called him, the asset. He'd worked in Russian nuclear facilities during the Soviet era, had legitimate expertise in warhead design, and had the credentials to sell himself convincingly as an arms dealer. He was also financially desperate, resentful about the collapse of his career, and increasingly erratic in his behavior. The CIA's counterintelligence unit raised immediate concerns. They ran background checks, conducted psychological evaluations, and monitored the asset's communications. Their assessment was blunt. This man was unstable and potentially unreliable. He'd been making unauthorized contact with former colleagues in Russia, asking questions about opportunities to return, seeking financial support from Russian nuclear institutes. The counterintelligence analysts warned that the asset might be playing both sides, that his motivations were murky, that he could compromise the entire operation if he decided his interests aligned more with Russia or even with Iran than with the CIA. Those warnings went up the chain to CIA leadership, and they were noted, filed, and ultimately overridden. The Directorate of Operations wanted Merlin to proceed. They argued that the asset's legitimate credentials outweighed the risks, that his financial desperation made him controllable, that the operation was too valuable to cancel over psychological concerns. Iran's nuclear program wasn't going to slow down while the CIA searched for a perfect asset who didn't exist. So, in 1999, with the asset recruited and on the payroll, CIA technical specialists began preparing the payload. This is where the second problem emerged, and it was more fundamental than the first. How do you create a deceptive document that's convincing enough to fool sophisticated nuclear scientists, but flawed enough to sabotage their work? The CIA's technical advisors split into opposing camps. One group argued for subtle flaws, errors so small and technical that only an expert would spot them, ensuring Iranian scientists would accept the documents as genuine and waste maximum time chasing the problems. The other group argued for more obvious flaws, reasoning that subtle errors might be caught quickly by competent engineers, defeating the entire purpose. But both groups worried about a more dangerous possibility. What if even a flawed blueprint provided Iran with useful information? Nuclear weapon design is cumulative knowledge. Even incomplete or partially incorrect technical data can help scientists understand the general principles, narrow their research directions, validate their own work, or identify productive avenues for experimentation. Some of the CIA's own nuclear physicists refused to participate in Merlin, arguing that the operation risked proliferating sensitive design principles regardless of the inserted flaws. Their concern was this: the Russian blueprints contained accurate information about dozens of technical parameters, component dimensions, material specifications, general design architecture. The CIA was only altering one specific element: the firing sequence timing. Everything else was genuine. Iranian scientists could potentially cross-reference the accurate portions against other sources, detect the flaw through independent analysis, correct it, and end up with a working design. In other words, the CIA might accidentally provide Iran with a roadmap to building a nuclear weapon while thinking they were sabotaging the effort. These concerns were documented in classified memoranda that circulated through CIA headquarters in late 1999. Analysts used phrases like unacceptable proliferation risk and potential net advantage to target. Some recommended canceling Merlin entirely. Others suggested using completely fabricated documents instead of modified genuine ones. But the Directorate of Operations had momentum on their side. Resources had been allocated. The asset was already trained. Vienna logistics were arranged. And there was another pressure weighing on the decision, one that wasn't written in the official memos, but was understood by everyone involved. Israel was growing impatient. Israeli intelligence had been tracking Iran's nuclear program closely, and the assessments coming out of Tel Aviv were increasingly alarming. If the United States couldn't demonstrate meaningful progress in penetrating and disrupting Iran's weapons development, Israel might decide to take unilateral action, sabotage operations, targeted killings of scientists, possibly even airstrikes against nuclear facilities. CIA leadership wanted to show progress, wanted to prove that intelligence operations could slow Iran's program without the regional destabilization that military action would cause. Merlin was supposed to be that proof. So, despite the warnings from counterintelligence, despite the concerns from technical advisors, Despite the documented proliferation risks, Operation Merlin received final authorization in December 1999. The asset was given his instructions. Vienna was chosen as the insertion point because Iran used its diplomatic mission there as a hub for sensitive procurement. The asset would pose as a Russian scientist selling stolen documents for cash. He'd make contact with Iranian officials, hand over the package, collect payment, and disappear. The CIA prepared supporting materials, a cover letter establishing the asset's bona fides, background documents that reinforced his cover story, and most importantly, the modified blueprints themselves, printed on paper that matched Soviet-era technical documentation. The operation was scheduled for January 2000. 3 weeks before departure, the asset underwent final training with his handlers, and that's when the third problem revealed itself. The asset wasn't following the script. During rehearsal sessions, he asked strange questions. What if Iran figured out the blueprints were doctored? What if they traced the documents back to him? What if Russian intelligence found out he'd betrayed classified weapon designs? His handlers tried to reassure him, emphasizing the operational security measures, the layers of deniability, the financial rewards waiting after successful completion. But the asset's behavior was deteriorating. He seemed anxious during meetings, distracted, increasingly focused on his own survival rather than the mission objectives. He raised ethical questions about whether the operation was justified, whether providing any nuclear weapon information to Iran was responsible regardless of the flaws. His CIA handlers noted these concerns in their pre-mission reports. But by this point, operational momentum was unstoppable. Pulling the asset would mean scrapping Merlin entirely, admitting to CIA leadership that all the warnings had been correct, accepting the political consequences of failure before the operation even launched. So in early January 2000, the asset boarded a flight to Vienna with the package secured in his luggage. His handlers maintained contact through prearranged secure communication windows, but once he was on the ground, he was largely on his own. That was the nature of this kind of operation. The CIA needed distance for deniability. What happened in Vienna over the next 48 hours would determine whether Operation Merlin became a triumph of intelligence tradecraft or a catastrophic mistake that accelerated the very threat it was designed to prevent. The asset checked into a modest hotel in Vienna's 7th district on a cold Tuesday morning. Nothing about the location was memorable. Exactly the point. The hotel catered to business travelers and tourists, the kind of place where guests came and went without drawing attention. His room was on the 3rd floor with a view of a courtyard. He set his luggage on the bed and stood at the window for a long time, watching nothing in particular, his mind cycling through the mission protocol he'd rehearsed dozens of times. The Iranian diplomatic mission was 15 minutes away by foot. His contact window was scheduled for Thursday morning between 10 and 11. That gave him nearly 48 hours to conduct surveillance, confirm the route, identify potential complications. His handlers expected him to use that time carefully. Map escape routes, test communication procedures, mentally rehearse the handoff until it became automatic. Professional discipline was everything in this kind of operation. But the asset wasn't thinking about professional discipline. He was thinking about the package in his suitcase and what it really meant. That first evening, he walked to a cafe 3 blocks from the Iranian mission, ordered coffee, and positioned himself with a sightline to the entrance. For 2 hours, he watched the daily rhythm of the building. Security officers standing near the entrance, diplomatic vehicles arriving and departing, pedestrians passing without interest. Everything looked exactly as his CIA briefing materials had described. The mission operated with routine predictability. Thursday morning would be busy enough to provide cover, but not so chaotic that his approach would draw unusual scrutiny. He returned to his hotel room that night and didn't sleep. Instead, he sat at the small desk and stared at the package. The CIA had sealed it professionally. Heavy manila envelope, diplomatic-style markings, nothing that would trigger suspicion if inspected. Inside were the blueprints, the cover letter establishing his credentials, and instructions for follow-up contact. The asset opened the envelope, spread the blueprints across the desk. studied them under the dim light. He'd reviewed this material dozens of times during training, but now, alone in a Vienna hotel room with the mission hours away, the documents looked different. The technical drawings were exquisite, precise specifications for an implosion system, detailed component layouts, mathematical calculations for compression dynamics. Even with the inserted flaw, these blueprints represented genuine weapons design knowledge, and the flaw itself, now that he examined it with fresh eyes, seemed almost insultingly obvious to someone with his expertise. The timing inversion in the detonator circuit would prevent proper compression. Yes, but the error was detectable. Any competent nuclear engineer studying this design would eventually spot the problem. And once they spotted it, they'd understand they were looking at intentionally sabotaged material, which meant they'd also understand that the rest of the document was likely genuine. They could strip out the flaw and keep everything else: the accurate component dimensions, the verified material specifications, the validated design architecture. The asset realized something that night that the CIA's analysts had debated for months. This operation might help Iran more than it hurt them. He pulled out a notepad and began writing 3 sentences in Russian. A warning that he'd spotted errors in the firing sequence, a recommendation for independent verification before any technical work proceeded. Writing those sentences was a decision that took him past the point of no return. He was deviating from his mission parameters, acting on his own judgment, betraying the CIA's trust. But in his mind, he was preventing a larger betrayal, stopping the United States from accidentally proliferating nuclear weapon design information to a hostile nation. Or maybe, in the chaos of his thoughts that night, he was just trying to protect himself. If Iran discovered the blueprints were doctored without his warning, they might assume he was a CIA asset and target him for retaliation. But if he warned them up front, he could maintain credibility as a genuinely concerned scientist, someone who'd stumbled onto compromised material and was trying to be honest. His motivations were tangled, contradictory, impossible to separate cleanly. Fear and ethics and self-preservation and resentment all mixed together. Wednesday, he made one final surveillance pass near the Iranian mission, confirmed the route, identified the cultural attaché's office based on window positions described in his briefing materials. Everything was ready for Thursday morning's handoff. Except he wasn't ready. Every instinct screamed at him to abort, to find some excuse to delay, to call his handlers and admit he couldn't go through with direct contact. Back in his hotel room, he made a decision. He would complete the delivery, but he would modify the protocol. Instead of walking into the mission and handing the package directly to an Iranian intelligence officer, he would use a dead drop. There was a diplomatic mail slot adjacent to the mission building. He'd spotted it during his surveillance. He could deposit the package there, maintaining the delivery while avoiding face-to-face contact. It was a compromise between completing his mission and managing his terror. The CIA would be unhappy with the deviation, but they'd accept it as long as the package reached Iranian hands. Thursday morning arrived clear and cold. The asset left his hotel at 9:30, carrying the package in a leather satchel. He walked the route he'd rehearsed, taking 20 minutes for a journey that should have taken 15, giving himself time to scan for surveillance, to watch for anything unusual. Nothing appeared wrong. Vienna's streets were busy with morning commuters. No one paid him attention. At 9:55, he reached the block where the Iranian mission stood. His contact window was opening. The cultural attaché would be in his office. The designated Iranian intelligence officer would be expecting a visitor matching the asset's description. The asset walked past the mission entrance once, continuing down the street, delaying the moment of commitment. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Sweat ran down his sides, despite the January cold. At the corner, he stopped, turned around, walked back toward the mission. This was it. This was the moment when he had to either execute the handoff or abort the entire operation. He reached the mission entrance. The 2 security officers were at their posts. One of them glanced at the asset with professional disinterest. The asset kept walking, couldn't stop himself, couldn't force his legs to turn toward the entrance. His entire body was rejecting the mission. 10 meters past the entrance, he saw the diplomatic mail slot. A simple metal receptacle built into the wall, used for routine document deliveries. His hand went to the satchel, pulled out the package. In one smooth motion, he shoved it through the mail slot. The package disappeared into the Iranian mission. No face-to-face contact, no conversation, no opportunity for the CIA to monitor the Iranian reaction in real time. But that wasn't the worst deviation. The asset's hand went back into his satchel, pulled out the handwritten note he'd composed 2 nights earlier. The warning about errors in the firing sequence. The recommendation for independent verification. He stared at the note for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. This was the final decision point. With this note, he would destroy Operation Merlin's entire purpose. Without it, there was still a chance the deception would work. He folded the note, pushed it through the mail slot after the package. Then he walked away, maintaining a steady pace, fighting the urge to run. His training told him to execute a surveillance detection route, to spend the next 2 hours confirming he wasn't being followed before returning to his hotel. But his nerves were shot. He went straight back, ignoring protocol, thinking only about getting off the street. In his hotel room, he called his handler using the prearranged secure callback procedure. The conversation was brief and ambiguous. The asset confirmed he'd completed the delivery, but didn't mention the deviations. His handler asked if there were any complications. The asset said no. They agreed on the extraction timeline. The asset would remain in Vienna for 24 hours to ensure the delivery was received, then depart on his scheduled flight. The handler sensed something off in the asset's voice, but couldn't identify it specifically. Tension was normal after a high-stakes operation. Some nervousness was expected. The handler noted the call in his log and waited for signals intelligence to confirm Iranian receipt of the package. But the asset sat in his hotel room knowing he'd just committed an act that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He'd betrayed the CIA's mission. He'd potentially provided Iran with genuine nuclear weapon design information, and he had no idea which side would come after him first. 24 hours later, he boarded his flight out of Vienna. The package was in Iranian hands. The warning note was with it. And Operation Merlin was already a failure, though it would take the CIA months to understand just how badly the operation had backfired. The CIA's monitoring systems went active the moment the asset left Vienna. Signals intelligence assets focused on Iranian communications. Human sources inside Iran's procurement networks watched for unusual activity. Financial intelligence units tracked for suspicious transactions that might indicate Iran was seeking specialized components. The analysts knew what to expect. If the operation worked as designed, Iranian scientists would study the blueprints, begin planning their manufacturing process, and start requesting quotes for specific materials. Those procurement requests would create observable signatures, communications with suppliers, financial transfers, shipping arrangements. The CIA would map those networks, identify the front companies Iran used for sensitive acquisitions, and build targeting packages for future disruption. But in the weeks after the Vienna handoff, nothing happened. No procurement requests, no suspicious communications, no financial activity matching expected patterns, just silence. At first, the analysts weren't concerned. Iranian intelligence was cautious and sophisticated. They wouldn't move quickly on sensitive material from an unknown source. There would be validation procedures, internal reviews, careful authentication before any operational decisions. The CIA expected a delay measured in weeks, possibly months. But as January turned to February and February turned to March, the silence became ominous. In April 2000, signals intelligence finally picked up something. Iranian secure communications referencing external technical material being forwarded to specialized physics units. The intercepts were fragmentary and heavily encoded, but they confirmed the package had been received and was under examination. That should have been encouraging. It meant Iran was taking the blueprint seriously. But the lack of procurement activity suggested something else, that Iranian scientists were being extremely cautious, possibly suspicious about the material's authenticity. CIA analysts began constructing hypothetical scenarios for Iran's internal processing. The most likely model looked something like this. Upon receiving the package, Iranian intelligence would immediately compartmentalize the material. A small security team would conduct initial triage, checking for tracking devices, analyzing the paper and ink for forensic markers, running the documentation through authentication procedures. Only after passing that screening would the technical content reach scientific evaluators. Those scientific evaluators would be Iran's most trusted nuclear experts, people with both technical sophistication and absolute loyalty. They would cross-reference the blueprints against known archives, Soviet-era publications, and their own research. They would look for internal inconsistencies, technical impossibilities, deliberate markers of deception, and they would find the asset's warning note. The CIA didn't know about that note yet. The asset hadn't mentioned it in his debriefs. He'd filed standard post-mission reports describing the delivery, but omitting the critical detail that he'd warned Iran about errors in the design. So, CIA analysts were constructing scenarios based on incomplete information. They debated whether the inserted flaw was too obvious or too subtle. They wondered if Iranian scientists had sufficient expertise to evaluate the blueprints independently. They calculated probability estimates for various outcomes. What they didn't realize was that the entire foundation of their analysis was wrong. Iran wasn't trying to determine if the blueprints contained errors. They'd been explicitly told the blueprints contained errors. The question Iranian scientists were asking was different. Could they extract useful information despite the flaws? And the answer to that question was almost certainly yes. Nuclear weapon design is fundamentally about physics and engineering. The principles are well understood. Compress fissile material to supercritical density, and you get a chain reaction. The difficulty is in the execution. How do you machine plutonium components to microscopic tolerances? How do you synchronize explosive lenses to create perfectly symmetrical compression? How do you design neutron initiators that function reliably? How do you model the weapon's performance without conducting actual nuclear tests? These are the hard problems that separate countries with theoretical nuclear knowledge from countries with operational nuclear weapons. And the Russian blueprints, even with the inserted timing flaw, provided Iranian scientists with validated approaches to solving many of these problems. The component dimensions were accurate, giving Iran precise specifications for manufacturing. The material requirements were correct, helping Iran understand what they needed to acquire. The general design architecture was sound, showing Iran how various subsystems integrated together. The timing flaw in the detonator circuit was serious, yes. It would prevent the weapon from functioning properly, but it was also correctable. Any competent nuclear engineer studying the design would eventually spot the timing inversion, recognize it as an error, and fix it. They might even guess it was an intentional flaw, but that wouldn't diminish the value of everything else in the documents. Iranian scientists likely ran the blueprints through multiple review cycles, academic validations comparing the design against theoretical models, small-scale component tests to verify specific claims, consultation with external experts using carefully compartmentalized questions. Over weeks and months, they would have built confidence that the documents represented genuine Russian weapons technology with at least one known error. The strategic question for Iranian leadership was what to do with this information. Using the blueprints immediately would be risky. If the CIA was monitoring their procurement activity, any purchases matching the design specifications would reveal Iranian intentions. But archiving the material for long-term reference carried different risks. The information might become obsolete, or the political window for developing weapons might close. Iran chose caution. They studied the blueprints extensively, but made no immediate procurement moves that would signal to external monitoring that they possessed advanced weapons designs. Instead, the material likely entered their classified reference library, available for theoretical research but not for immediate operational use. For the CIA, this caution looked like success. No procurement signatures meant Iran wasn't building weapons based on the blueprints. The absence of activity suggested the deception was working. But that interpretation was exactly backwards. The lack of procurement activity meant Iran was sophisticated enough to recognize they'd received compromised material, cautious enough not to expose their capabilities, and confident enough to extract useful knowledge without walking into CIA traps. Through 2001 and into 2002, the CIA's internal assessment of Operation Merlin remained tentatively positive. The operation hadn't produced the intelligence windfall they'd hoped for. No exposed procurement networks, no mapped supply chains, but it also hadn't failed catastrophically. There were no indicators that Iran had used the blueprints to advance their weapons program. That assessment began to crack in 2003 when analysts started asking harder questions. Why had Iran shown no interest in following up with the source? Why were there no attempts to acquire additional technical material? Why had the entire operation produced such a muted response? One analyst proposed a disturbing possibility. What if Iran had recognized the blueprints as a CIA operation from the beginning? What if the inserted flaw had been too obvious to credible nuclear scientists? What if the whole deception had been transparent? That analysis triggered a review of the asset's mission performance. Analysts pulled his post-operation debriefs and looked for inconsistencies. They found them. Small details that didn't quite align, ambiguous statements about the handoff procedure, defensive responses when questioned about deviations from protocol. In late 2003, the asset was called in for an enhanced debrief. Under sustained questioning, his story began to unravel. He admitted he hadn't made face-to-face contact as instructed. He'd used a dead drop instead, depositing the package in a mail slot. That admission was bad enough. It meant the CIA had lost the opportunity to observe Iranian reaction in real time, had sacrificed visibility into their validation procedures. But the next admission was worse. The asset revealed he'd included a personal note warning Iranian scientists about errors in the design. He'd essentially told them the blueprints were doctored, destroying any chance that the deception would work as planned. The debriefing room went silent when he admitted that. The CIA officers present realized they were looking at one of the agency's most spectacular intelligence failures, not because the operation had been conducted incompetently, but because the asset had independently decided to sabotage the mission he'd been recruited to execute. When they asked him why, his answer was a confused mix of ethics and self-preservation. He claimed he'd been trying to prevent nuclear proliferation by warning Iran not to trust the blueprints. He also admitted he'd been afraid Iran would discover the deception and target him for retaliation. He wanted to position himself as an honest broker rather than a CIA asset. The officers asked if he'd been in contact with Russian intelligence, if he'd been playing multiple sides, if his loyalties had ever really belonged to the CIA. The asset denied it, but his denials weren't convincing. His financial records showed he'd continued seeking opportunities to return to Russia. His communications had included unauthorized contacts with former colleagues. His psychological profile had been unstable from the beginning. The counterintelligence unit that had warned against using him in 1998 had been exactly right. The asset was unreliable, motivated by conflicting interests, psychologically unsuited for the operational demands of solo disinformation work. Every warning had been documented, and every warning had been overridden by operational leadership who wanted Merlin to proceed. They dissented. Now in 2003, with the truth finally exposed, CIA analysts had to conduct a damage assessment. What had Operation Merlin actually accomplished? The assessment was devastating. Instead of misleading Iranian scientists, the CIA had potentially provided them with genuine nuclear weapon design information. Instead of exposing procurement networks, the operation had produced zero intelligence about Iranian capabilities. Instead of slowing Iran's program, the CIA may have accelerated it by providing validated technical approaches they hadn't possessed before. The operation had cost millions of dollars, consumed years of planning, and involved some of the CIA's most sensitive technical resources, and it had achieved nothing except possibly helping Iran move closer to a functional nuclear weapon. I have to pause here and ask you something. Put yourself in the position of those CIA analysts who'd warned against Operation Merlin from the beginning. They'd documented the risks. They'd identified the asset as unreliable. They'd raised concerns about proliferation. And they'd been overruled by operational leadership who wanted the mission to proceed. When the truth finally came out in 2003, those analysts were proven right about everything. But their vindication came at the cost of a strategic intelligence failure that potentially strengthened one of America's primary adversaries. If you were one of those analysts watching your warnings being ignored in real time, would you have pushed harder to stop the operation? Would you have escalated to higher levels of CIA leadership, risked your career by making noise? Or would you have documented your concerns and accepted that the final decision wasn't yours to make? Drop your answer in the comments below, because this is the impossible position intelligence professionals face constantly, knowing something is wrong but not having the authority to stop it. Here's what happened next. The CIA's internal review of Operation Merlin took place in strict secrecy. No public acknowledgement, no congressional briefings, just a classified postmortem that tried to identify what went wrong and how to prevent similar failures in future operations. The findings were blunt. The operation had failed due to multiple cascading errors in judgment. First, over-reliance on a single human asset with documented psychological issues. The counterintelligence warnings had been explicit and early, but operational momentum had overridden those concerns. The review recommended mandatory red team analysis for any future operation dependent on a single unreliable source. Second, payload design that was too technically rich. Even with intentional flaws, the blueprints contained genuine weapons design knowledge that gave Iran a net advantage. The review recommended stricter protocols for technical deception, including explicit rules against providing any information that could advance target capabilities regardless of inserted errors. Third, insufficient contingency planning for asset deviation. The operation had no real-time capability to detect or correct the asset's unauthorized actions. Once he was on the ground in Vienna, the CIA had minimal visibility and zero control. The review recommended enhanced monitoring and immediate extraction procedures for any high-stakes solo operations. Fourth, inadequate assessment of strategic risk versus tactical gain. The operation's potential intelligence benefits, mapping procurement networks, exposing Iranian capabilities, didn't justify the proliferation risk of providing advanced weapons designs to a hostile nation. The review recommended elevated approval thresholds for operations involving sensitive technical information. These findings circulated through CIA leadership in 2004. Reforms were implemented, new protocols were drafted, training programs were updated to emphasize the Merlin case study as an example of how even carefully planned operations can fail catastrophically when human factors are misjudged. But the reforms came too late to undo the damage. Iran had the blueprints. Iranian scientists had studied them, extracted useful information, and integrated that knowledge into their expanding nuclear program. And there was no way to take it back. The story should have ended there, buried in classified archives, known only to the intelligence professionals involved. But in 2006, everything changed when a New York Times journalist began investigating CIA operations related to Iran's nuclear program. The journalist's sources inside the intelligence community were willing to talk, frustrated by what they saw as reckless operations that had backfired. Operation Merlin became part of a larger story about CIA efforts to counter Iranian weapons development, and the details that emerged were damaging. The newspaper article described the operation's basic structure: the Russian scientist, the doctored blueprints, the Vienna handoff. It revealed that the asset had warned Iran about the flaws, effectively destroying the deception. And it raised questions about whether the CIA had inadvertently helped Iran's nuclear program rather than hindered it. The publication triggered congressional oversight investigations. Classified briefings were held behind closed doors, where CIA officials had to explain how an operation designed to slow Iran's nuclear progress might have accelerated it. Intelligence Committee members wanted accountability. They wanted to know who had authorized Merlin, who had ignored the warnings, who bore responsibility for the failure. Those investigations were contentious and inconclusive. The classified nature of the operation made public accountability difficult. The complexity of nuclear weapons technology meant even congressional overseers struggled to assess the technical damage. And the political sensitivity of Iran's nuclear program meant both Democrats and Republicans had reasons to avoid prolonged public debate about intelligence failures. So the investigations eventually closed without dramatic consequences. Some officials retired quietly. Some protocols were changed. The CIA moved on to other operations, other theaters, other adversaries. But Operation Merlin's legacy persisted in ways that extended far beyond the immediate participants. For the intelligence community, Merlin became a teaching case about the limits of technical deception. The operation demonstrated that disinformation campaigns involving sophisticated scientific material are extraordinarily difficult to execute successfully. Target nations have their own experts who can evaluate technical claims, detect inconsistencies, and extract useful information even from intentionally flawed documents. For analysts studying Iran's nuclear program, Merlin represented a missed opportunity and a possible accelerant. Instead of slowing Iranian weapons development, the operation may have provided Iranian scientists with validated design approaches they could incorporate into their research. The extent of that advantage remains unclear. Iran has never acknowledged receiving the blueprints, and their nuclear program has developed through multiple pathways involving indigenous research, foreign procurement, and covert acquisition. For CIA operational planners, Merlin became a cautionary example about asset reliability and operational discipline. No matter how elegant the plan, no matter how sophisticated the technical preparation, operations dependent on single, unreliable human sources carry unacceptable risks. The asset's psychological instability and divided loyalties should have been disqualifying factors, and the fact that those concerns were overridden represented a fundamental failure in operational judgment. And for the asset himself, Operation Merlin ended his career in intelligence work and left him in a gray zone of competing loyalties and uncertain consequences. He'd betrayed the CIA's mission by warning Iran about the flaws. He'd potentially betrayed his Russian colleagues by participating in a CIA operation involving their classified weapons designs. And he'd made himself a person of interest to multiple intelligence services, none of which could quite determine whether he'd been an asset, a double agent, or simply an unstable individual caught between conflicting pressures. He disappeared from public view after the New York Times article. His current location and status remain unknown. Some intelligence professionals believe he returned to Russia and reconciled with former colleagues. Others think he's living under an assumed identity somewhere in Europe, trying to avoid attention from both Western and Russian services. A few analysts speculate he may have been eliminated quietly by one side or another as an unreliable witness to sensitive operations. The nuclear blueprints he delivered to Iran in January 2000 likely still exist in Iranian archives. Whether they've been used, studied, or forgotten remains classified information known only to Iranian scientists and the intelligence services monitoring their program. Iran's nuclear development has continued along multiple tracks. They've built centrifuge cascades for uranium enrichment, advanced their missile technology, conducted research on warhead miniaturization, and expanded their nuclear infrastructure. Western intelligence agencies track these developments closely, trying to determine how close Iran is to a functional nuclear weapon. Some of that progress is indigenous, Iranian scientists solving problems through their own research. Some comes from foreign assistance through networks in Pakistan, North Korea, and elsewhere. And some, possibly, derives from the information contained in those Russian blueprints the asset dropped into a Vienna mailbox on a cold January morning. If you've made it this far, thank you for taking this journey through one of the CIA's most troubling intelligence operations. This channel is dedicated to bringing you real spy stories every single day, operations that shaped history, tradecraft that changed the game, and the human cost behind every mission. We cover successful operations and catastrophic failures, because both teach us something essential about the world of espionage and covert action. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. Hit that button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode, because the operations we're covering in coming weeks include Cold War deceptions that actually worked, modern counterintelligence operations against sophisticated adversaries, and the evolving tradecraft of 21st century espionage. So, what do you think? Was Operation Merlin doomed from the start? Or could better asset management have salvaged the operation? Should the CIA have listened to the analysts who warned against it? Or was the attempt to slow Iran's nuclear program worth the risk? And more broadly, is technical disinformation ever a viable strategy against sophisticated adversaries? Or does it always carry too much risk of helping rather than hindering? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and these debates about intelligence strategy and operational ethics are what make this community valuable. Operation Merlin remains classified in many of its details. The full extent of what Iran learned from those blueprints may never be known publicly. The asset's ultimate fate stays uncertain. But the operation's lessons are clear and documented. Intelligence operations built on unstable foundations fail. Warnings from counterintelligence professionals should be heeded, not overridden. Technical deception against sophisticated adversaries requires multiple redundancies and absolute operational control. And sometimes, the most dangerous moment in any operation isn't when something goes wrong. It's when operational leadership refuses to admit something could go wrong. The Russian scientist standing outside Iran's diplomatic mission that January morning in Vienna wasn't thinking about any of those lessons. He was thinking about survival, about competing loyalties, about the weight of the package in his hands. When he chose to add that warning note, he made a decision that echoed through the intelligence community for years afterward. Whether that decision was betrayal or ethics, cowardice or conscience, depends on which side of the operation you're standing on. But its consequences were undeniable. Operation Merlin failed because one man, at the critical moment, chose a different path than the one his handlers had planned. And in the world of espionage, where success depends on precision and discipline, that kind of deviation destroys everything.